Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at the character Mary. There are many Marys in the Bible, and so we'll be looking at Jesus's own mother. Now, when we look at Jesus's mother, Mary, there are obviously many passages that we can look at. The part of the Bible that talks about, or the part of her story that we hear the most information on, is the birth narratives of Jesus. That's where she shows up, obviously, the most. But even after that, even though she's not mentioned in many other places, you get the idea that she's always in the background, that she's always somewhere perhaps nearby, and that she's aware of the ministry of Jesus. There is a mention of Jesus along with, there's a mention of Mary along with Jesus's brothers and sisters. So if you turn to Mark chapter 3, verse 31 to 32, there you'll see that while Jesus was inside a home, the siblings, along with the mother of Jesus, come to meet her. So I'll just go ahead and read those verses. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And we know how the rest of the story goes. Jesus acts like he doesn't know them and says, "Who are my brothers and who is my mother?" And then he points to the people sitting around him and he says, "Here is my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my mother, brother, and sister." So it's a interesting family dynamic that they seem to have here. Now, before we wonder as to why Jesus would treat them this way, we have to recognize that even within Jesus's family, we start to see that there is perhaps a little bit of doubt as to from the family members about the ministry of Jesus. There's a passage where they said that even his family wasn't sure that he was in his right mind. If you read later on, you see that even though the family doesn't seem to fully understand what Jesus's ministry is about, at least John's gospel paints us a slightly different picture in that when the siblings come to meet Jesus, Mary is not included in that list. So perhaps Mary didn't doubt. We're not quite sure. Mark chapter 6, verses 2 to 3. There we see another picture of Jesus's family where the people say, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Jose and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" So here now we notice that Mary seems to be, at this point, a single mom. We're not 100% sure what happened to Joseph. There aren't really any clear indications as to what happened. Most people go with the idea that it's quite likely that he would have passed away at a younger age, meaning Jesus and the siblings and Mary would have been on their own, and so Mary would have been a widow. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, there Paul considers James to be the actual authentic brother of Jesus. So we have a family that Jesus has. And then the question is, since the study is about Mary, did Mary actually have all these other children? And there are different church traditions. There are different beliefs as to how to understand that. For example, there are three very common views when it comes to understanding Mary as the mother, not only of Jesus, but as the mother of all of these other children. In the Marthoma Church and in most all Protestant churches, the idea is that Mary would have had other children after Jesus. And this is a common understanding, and it seems to be the most straightforward and simplest understanding when we read the Bible. Nonetheless, in other church traditions, for example, in the Catholic Church tradition, in the Orthodox Church tradition, there's an idea that perhaps Joseph himself was an older person, and he perhaps was a widower, and he brought children into the marriage. I think that's a stretch, but that is one other idea. And this could explain why he would have died, perhaps, earlier on in the life of Jesus. A third understanding, a third view, which is more common in the Catholic Church, is that the brothers and the sisters are not really brothers and sisters, but they're actually just cousins. And the challenge with that is it's not the usual translation of the Greek. The very straightforward translation is that these are the actual brothers and sisters of Jesus. And in fact, this idea that's there in the Catholic Church of what's called the perpetual virginity, that means that Mary remained as a virgin all her life. That's first mentioned in a book that's not in our Bible. It's mentioned in the Gospel of James. And that's a book that we don't have in our canon. Now, what the point of all of this is just to say that we in the Marthoma Church, we don't try to venerate Mary. We don't try to keep her as somehow different from every other wife that we know of in the world. She would have had a very special child that was first, that would have been by way of the Holy Spirit. But then after that, the Marthoma Church believes that she would have been a normal mom who had regular kids. And so this brings her back to the realm of normal human beings. And so when we go through the rest of this study and we see the things that she's capable of doing, she's capable of doing those things not because she's so different from us, but because of some other characteristic and quality that I think is accessible to every single one of us. So I think it's very important to understand this view of Mary as not having perpetual virginity, but instead as being a mom to not only Jesus, but also to many other children. In addition to Mary having her own kids, there seems to be one disciple who is especially close to Mary. And can anyone guess who that disciple would have been?
John.
Yeah, John. John would have been the one who's closest to Mary. We get that understanding because one, at the cross, Jesus looks at Mary and says, "Behold your son," while signaling perhaps to John, and then looks at John and says, "Behold your mother." And so they were to kind of take care of one another. And not only that, when you go through and read the account that John has of Mary, John seems to paint Mary in a slightly different picture, meaning that whereas the rest of the gospel writers leave room for us to wonder, did Mary doubt the ministry of Jesus? In John's gospel, we see very early on that Mary seems to be the only one who knows and gets and understands the ministry of Jesus. For example, the wedding feast at Cana. In John chapter 2, there, Jesus and his brothers and disciples are all there, and Jesus is requested by his mom, go and help out, like do something, fix the problem. She seemed to know that Jesus is very well capable of handling all kinds of situations. And so it seems that she certainly did trust in him. John does not exclude her. So in John chapter 7, verse 5 was the verse that I was alluding to earlier, when the rest of the siblings are wondering, should they trust in Jesus, or has he gone mad? John does not include Mary in that list. She's there at the cross. And not only is she there at the cross, even in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, we find that Mary is there with all of the other believers, and they are post-resurrection, they're all together. Imagine then, in that context, the role that Mary would have played as a spiritual leader and as the mother of that whole movement. And so she would have held a very high position within the community, even though it wouldn't have been as high as a man, because it was a male patriarchal society. It was a male dominated world. But I think it goes to show that even in a male world, the subtle hints that John gives us about Mary shows just how much they appreciated her. So here's one point then that we can take away. Mary, being the mother that she was definitely a good mother without being a helicopter mom. She was always around her son. She trusted her son to be able to handle the situation, but she didn't seem to have the need to micromanage her child. And that's an important point, I think. When we are growing up as parents, we have this urge to want to make sure that our children don't have any mistakes. We don't want them to ever fall. We don't want them to ever have to feel pain. But Mary is a person who understood and trusted her son and trusted God enough to be able to let Jesus do his ministry to his fullest extent. And what she did was, instead of getting in the way, she supports Jesus. And so from the background, from behind the scenes, we get this, this narrative that Mary would have been an extremely supportive mother. Remember how painful it would have been for her to stand at the cross, but she does. She stays there till the very end. And there's no mention of remorse or regret or doubt. She was committed to the cause that her son Jesus was committed to. So her presence definitely would have been an encouragement for him, especially considering the fact that Joseph would have passed away. She would have single-handedly raised them, all these children. So she must have been a very strong and resilient woman. It's interesting that the early church theologians, they don't really mention Mary a whole lot. But when they do mention Mary, it seems to be often in contrast with Eve in the garden. And so what's the greatest contrast then that can be pulled out? Whereas Eve was distracted and wanted what she wanted, where Eve took what she wanted, Mary was obedient and gave what she had. It's a completely opposite kind of mentality, where one woman, the woman of all of humanity, decides that she wants her life to be better, and she takes what she doesn't have for herself. And Mary is given this precious gift of God, the Son of God, and it is a gift. And she turns around and she gives this gift right back to God. That is the counter example, and this is the reversing to some small degree of the pattern that Adam and Eve started so long ago. When you look at the birth narratives, like if we go back to the beginning of the stories, and it's interesting to note that not every single gospel talks about the birth of Jesus, but Luke definitely does. Luke and Matthew, and especially in Luke's gospel, we see Gabriel meeting with Mary. So Luke chapter 1, verse 26 to 38. So there you see how Mary expresses her willingness to submit to God's plan, even though there was this obvious biological challenge, right? In verse 34, you can see, like, how can this be? I'm still a virgin. She's not in marriage. She's not had any kinds of relationships. Now, looking at that doubt that she had, it is a question that is raised, but it's not a doubt of disbelief. It is a doubt of faith. Now, this distinction is something that I think we oftentimes overlook. We may have had the impression that any kind of doubt that we have towards God is somehow a bad thing. And certainly there is a kind of doubt that isn't productive and fruitful in our faith. Like, just look at earlier on in the story in Luke's gospel, how Zechariah found out about how he is going to have a child, John, and he also showed some doubt. But his doubt seems to be of a different character. His doubt was reprimanded, whereas the doubt that Mary expresses is not punished. Instead, it seems that God just continues on with the narrative that he has for her, the story and the truth and the promises that he has for her. So how do we understand this? So there is a doubt that refuses to believe something can be true. But then there's a doubt that wants to understand how it can be true. Now, these two doubts, though they might sound the same when a child asks us a question, or when we have our own some questions about our faith, though it may sound the same, the intention of the questions are very different. Here, I think this is a doubt of faith, not a doubt of disbelief. She has a gap in her understanding. How can God accomplish such a thing? It's never happened before. It's never happened since. We have no way of comprehending how such a birth could be possible. And in this gap, she just asks, how is it possible? It's not as though she refuses to bridge the gap. In fact, she trusts in God, and she is able to allow her faith. Faith is that thing that bridges the gap. And knowing that there's a gap, she's just simply asking about that space in between. This kind of doubt helps her to be authentic with God. She is not super confident, or she's not projecting some sort of false piety by saying, oh, sure, of course, God, I will completely believe everything that you say, which is perhaps what sometimes we think is good faith. Good faith is not blind faith. Blind faith is a kind of faith that never seeks answers. But Mary is one who sought answers because she knew that there is a gap, and she bridges the gap with her faith, but nonetheless, she wants to probe God some more. This kind of faith can lead, this kind of doubt, this kind of a questioning can lead to deeper faith. Whereas sometimes when we don't ask the questions that we have in our heart, it leads to a kind of shallow and very fragile kind of faith. See, the kind of doubt that we have when we are not sure, why is there so much suffering in the world around us? I'm not going to ask this question. I'm going to be a good Christian and just trust God. Well, that's one approach, certainly. But when we do that, we're never going to understand the deep beauty that is there in the cross, and how the cross addresses this problem of human suffering and the sovereignty of God. And there's so many other passages, like the entire book of Job is getting into that gap. It's trying to explore and understand God more. And when we do that, our faith only grows through it. And as finite creatures, there's always going to be some gap in our understanding. So if we don't have any doubts, it means that we don't have any gaps. And if there's no gap, then what faith is there? So if faith is required, it means that there is a gap. And if there is a gap, it's okay. It's okay to ask questions about that. Believing without having all the answers is okay. But believing without asking questions is not okay. We should be brave enough to know that God is big enough to handle all of our doubts. So she is one who seeks understanding. And why am I pushing this point so hard? Because this is how we're able to understand her next actions. What does Mary do next? Mary trusts God, and yet it seems as though the angel is presenting her with the opportunity to find more substantive proof. The angel tells, hey, even Elizabeth is pregnant right now. So what does Mary do? She goes to meet Elizabeth. And in doing so, she takes comfort in knowing that, oh, this is true. The doubt that I had about myself isn't fully answered, but I'm glad I asked that question, because now I got to see some small glimmer of the answer through the life of Elizabeth. Elizabeth being so old in her age, it was also unreasonable, unimaginable that she would be pregnant. And yet here she is, pregnant. Now, imagine being in that day and age. We may not have a map of Israel clearly in our mind, but in the northern part of Israel, towards the northern part, is where you have Galilee. And in Galilee, you have the small little town of Nazareth. From Nazareth to get to Jerusalem, or Judea, where Elizabeth and Zechariah would have been, it's about a 90-mile journey. And there's no cars back then. It would have been a 90-mile journey by foot. There's no mention of Joseph traveling with her. We're not sure. Maybe Joseph went with her. Maybe she traveled alone. But nonetheless, imagine she's expecting now, and she travels 90 miles in order to understand more clearly what God is up to. Such persistent pursuit of truth is a very admirable quality. Oftentimes, I think we give up far too soon in finding out the truth about God. If something starts to get a little hard, or if the passage that we need to read is a little too long, or if the day gets dark and we're a little too tired, we postpone that search for truth, and we push aside that doubt that we have, and we never get a chance to truly, fully probe it. But here, Mary, a very persistent young Mary, travels 90 miles to see her. Now, by this time, we get the idea that she would have been with Elizabeth for perhaps 3 months, and possibly till even the birth of John, seeing this all come to fruition. We're not 100% sure about that, but eventually she does go back to Nazareth. Then she goes to Bethlehem. Then she goes to Egypt. Then she comes back to Nazareth, and then she goes back to Jerusalem for the time of purification. She's all over the place. She is a hardworking person who does not accept sitting around as an acceptable lifestyle. I think this point is completely understood by everyone in this group, because it's busy. It's hard work being a mom, and you never get a moment to sit and rest, it feels. And you're constantly on the move, and you're constantly busy. Sometimes I think that the weight of those burdens ought to be shared more, but at least take comfort in the fact that Mary was just as busy as any of us, if not more busy, and she was on the move constantly. Look forward in the life of Mary. You see, after the birth of John, and when it comes time for Mary to give her song of praise, you look at Luke chapter 1, verse 46 to 55. And this is what's called, and it's based on the Latin, the Magnificat. It is there in our liturgy. So every time we do our divine service, we go through the Song of Mary, right? So, and we read it responsively. just look through it, and from there you can also get more insight into the character of Mary. What is the first thing that Mary does in this song? She gives praise. She is rejoicing over what God has done in her life. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. The idea that she is a person who is so blessed to be able to carry to term the Son of God. Her first words are not like Eve was, "Behold, I have produced a man." And we've discussed this in our earlier Bible study on the character of Eve. Completely opposite to that. Here, Mary's first thing is to give glory to God. The success of a good mother is best seen by a woman who praises God and not herself. There are many things that we can be proud of, many accomplishments that we have done that are definitely worthy of appreciation. But Mary knows that the credit first goes to God. And so she praises God and she rejoices. In verse 48, "For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed." Her greatness is contrasted with her own lowliness, her own humility. And it's really her humiliation. Because let's be very honest about it. How would we feel if we found out that someone in our church had a child outside of marriage? It becomes a very big stigma. This is the same sort of stigma, if not worse, that Mary would have felt. And perhaps this is one other reason why Mary decides to go off to see Elizabeth, because nobody knows when she was married, perhaps in that area. And so if she starts to show signs of the expecting child, no one would ask any questions. Whereas if she stayed in Nazareth, there would have been a lot of questions, a lot of stares, a lot of murmuring happening in the background. To be favored by God in this way was almost like a social curse. But she contrasts her greatness with this experience that she went through. God uses unexpected people. He takes a simple woman and uses her for great purposes. Notice that her best qualification is simply her willingness to trust in God. We're moving into, at least in our church now, right, a season of elections. And every time elections come up, one of the common things for why people don't take positions is, "Oh, I'm not ready for it. I'm not qualified for it. That's not me. I don't have the leadership characteristics for it." The only characteristic, the only quality that God needs from us is our willingness to submit. He doesn't need for us to be great people, the smartest, the fastest, the best at anything. He just needs us to be humble enough to say, "Use me." And that's what we see from Mary. And so you see that then the phrase goes from how he looked at favor upon the lowliness of his servant, and from now on. So what brought her shame now becomes the reason for her blessedness. Our lack of qualifications that people may look down upon us for not having, this will be the from now on moment, because when you submit to God, he is able to use each and every one of us far beyond what we could have ever imagined. And that becomes the position upon which we can boast, not in our greatness, but in that God was able to use someone just like us. So think about what aspects of our motherhood are looked down upon, are considered to be undervalued. Those are the values that Christ and that God values the most. And those are the ones that God uses to bless the people the most. Culture is changing, the times are changing. There used to be a day and age when staying a stay-at-home mom, there was no other choice. And there is now a time when both men and women can go and work. And there are some people who will look down on women who do stay at home and spend more time with the children, as if that were somehow a bad thing. Well, they're able to raise their kids and show more love and affection. Or somehow the ability of a woman to go and use her gifts and use her talents in the workplace. There was a day and age when that was looked down upon. No, 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 no. She shouldn't be projecting herself like that. But now that has become a source of blessing for our families as well, when our women can get educated and go and do things in the world. Right. So this is the sort of thing that we need to recognize God's hand in all of this, and how he's able to transform the lowliness of our positions and instead use them to bless the people around us. Finally, let's move forward to the last couple of things that we want to point out. There's so many things that we can point out, but because of time, we're not going to cover everything. Look at verse 49. For the mighty one has done great things for me, and holy is his name. So her submission gains her no credit, right? So she doesn't try to say, I am a pavam person, but God, look, he's made me super rich and I'm so awesome now. Like, that's not how she does it. She still will say that even this experience of blessedness that she has, it's God who's doing those great things for me. So she gives all credit, all recognition back to God. A good Christian, not just a good woman or a good man, but a good human being does this. Paul does this. He does not take any credit for the fact that God was able to use him as the evangelist and the apostle to the entire non-Jewish world. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. He wrote more books. He didn't write more words. John wrote the most words in the New Testament, but Paul wrote the most number of books or letters in the New Testament compared to any other New Testament writer. And in all of these things, he says, I will not boast in anything but my weakness. And then he talks about how great God is. Verse 50, his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. And then he goes on, right? So Mary was able to recognize God's style. And God's style is to do what? Well, God brings down the high and the mighty, and he lifts up the lowly. He exalts those who are humble and who are submissive, and he brings down, he humbles those who are overly arrogant. Mary is right to see God as someone who would go after the neglected and the overlooked, because she was able to very humbly evaluate herself that way. What experiences do you all have as women that help you to see attributes of God more clearly? In what ways are you overlooked and neglected, but knowing that God sees you gives you a better understanding of God and his true nature than someone who has had everything handed to them, or someone who feels as though they deserve all the things that they have. And so the experiences that you share with Mary reveal to you a side of God that the world needs to know. And so we're so thankful that Mary's song has been recorded for generations to come. But Mary had the blessed experience and therefore a unique understanding of the character of God. And this perspective only came about because of her willingness and her submission to God. Knowing that, she is able to understand this God must be like this for everyone. So when we read the story of Mary, you can't help but walk away thinking that God uses each one of us the exact same way. And if that's the case, there's so many things that we have to learn and emulate from the life of Mary. So we'll pause there and take any questions that you may have.